Hi folks, we're just given a few seconds for Zoom to let people in before we get started here. If you are already in our Zoom webinar here with us tonight, you can open up your chat window and find some information about how to purchase tonight's featured books. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Chelsea from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event, Authors in Conversation, Politics of Then and Now in Historical Fiction, featuring Tauno Biltsted presenting his book, The Anatomist's Tale, Kris Waldherr presenting her book, The Lost History of Dreams, and Anca Szilágyi presenting her book, Daughters of the Air. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thank you to Tauno, Kris, Anca, and the teams at Lanternfish Press and Atria Books for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make this space for conversation and connection. Now I have just a couple of housekeeping things. First, in our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees on the top of your Zoom screen. There are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon at the bottom of your Zoom window that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That is a great way to show your appreciation for the author and to interact with your fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the authors, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our social channels later on. And importantly, tonight's featured book, The Anatomist's Tale, The Lost History of Dreams, and Daughters of the Air, are available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations, noon to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Tauno, Kris, and Anca's books and many others on site. Or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. You can find that buy link in the chat. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured books is a great way to show your support. Now to introduce our featured authors. Our featured authors tonight are Tauno Biltsted, Kris Waldherr, and Anca Szilágyi. Tauno Biltsted has been a cab driver, squatter on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, mediator and facilitator, and roustabout construction worker. His fiction has been published in Rosebud Magazine and the Akashic Books Mondays Are Murder series, and his nonfiction has been published in World War III Illustrated Wobblies, A Graphic History of the IWW, and Perspectives on Anarchist Theory. He holds a master's degree in international relations. His book, The Anatomist's Tale, relates one man's brush with the heady freedom of outlaws and the price of returning to civilization. The former pirate's confessions of his past are chronicled with verve and irony in this meticulously researched historical debut. Kris Waldherr is an award-winning author, illustrator, and designer. She's a member of the Historical Novel Society, and her fiction has been awarded with fellowships by the Virginia Center of the Creative Arts and a reading grant by Poets and Writers. Kris works and lives in Brooklyn in a Victoria-era house with her husband, the anthropologist-curator Thomas Ross Miller, and their daughter. Her book, The Lost History of Dreams, follows a post-mortem photographer who unearths dark secrets from the past that may hold the key to his future. This captivating debut novel is a sweeping and atmospheric gothic mystery about love and loss that blurs lines between past and present, truth and fiction, and ultimately life and death. Anca Szilágyi grew up in Brooklyn. Her writing has appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Electric Literature, Gastronomica, and Fairy Tale Review, among other publications. She is the recipient of the inaugural Artist Trust Garlisow Storyteller Award, a Made at Hugo House Fellowship, and awards from the Vermont Studio Center for Culture, the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, and the Jack Straw Cultural Center. The Stranger hailed Anca as one of the fresh new faces in Seattle fiction. Her book, Daughters of the Air, follows a young woman's struggle to cope with her father's disappearance during Argentina's Dirty War. This stunning debut masterfully explores the individual trauma born from a repressive political regime. Each author is going to start us off with a reading from their book, and then they'll be talking with each other and with all of you. I'll let our first reader, Tauno, take it away.
Hey, Chelsea, thank you so much. And thanks so much to Greenlight for hosting this. And I also want to express my appreciation for the folks at Lanternfish for publishing my book and Anka's book. And I'm so happy to be here with Anca and Kris. I think this is going to be a good conversation. So I'm going to start off with reading a little selection from, it's kind of towards the end of the book. And then we're going to have a few questions. So we were kind of going to do it where I was going to read something and then Kris read something and Anca was going to read something, have a little conversation, then open it up to the audience. I will start and so where the action is. So the book is, it's very simply, it's a pirate story. Early 18th century in the Atlantic world. And we can talk what that was as a world. But I'll start off with just doing reading, which is towards the end, which describes this space where this group of pirates end up. It was the pirates that called it New Madagascar after the storied town on the true island of Madagascar, and that is how I will refer to it. But the place had a multitude of names, as the people there spoke many tongues, and no one of them owned it more than any other. Horacio told me he heard it called Palenque de Flores, after the drooping orchids that were found in the crooks of trees throughout the vast swamp. Some elders called it Cocodrilo Sagrado, in homage to the crocodiles that lurked in the dark waters there to flatter their lazy hunger and keep them from toothsome children. The Maroons, who were absconded from slaving on English plantations, had many names for it too. In the market, they called it Freeman, for Freedman's Land, but they also called it Starlight and Old Man's Swamp. They called it Whisper of Wings, for the place was infested with mosquitoes near the whole year round, and some of them called it Sikadwa, for the seat of an ancestral kingdom in the valley of Asante, inland from the western coast of Africa. There were visitors there come up from Palmares in the country of Brazil, a fabled city of Maroons that fended off every attempt to roust it from its lands. They called the place Quilombo de Pantano, which means war camp of the swamps, in their hybrid of Portuguese and Ghanaian dialects. Decisions of any import were made in council meetings where every vested resident had the opportunity to speak. Curanderas and obeya men were granted a regular position on the council to weigh in on matters pertaining to the intersection of the invisible and visible worlds. Those with skills in defense of the settlement and procurement of raiding treasures also had positions, and there were representatives from each small community that comprised the great mix of peoples found at New Madagascar, and from the occupational associations, including the fish farmers and the weavers and the house builders. Council meetings were a drawn-out affair, but the people of New Madagascar are endowed with an easy patience, and each speaker would be pointed and succinct, knowing that the murmur of their statement had to ripple through the assembled crowd from one language to the other until each craning ear had its fill of understanding. The council was held at a plaza on an island near the center of the swamp. When deliberations touched on matters of great importance, there was not enough room on solid land to hold the crowds, so the waters around were filled with rafts. At night, each bobbing craft was illuminated by delicate lanterns made from woven palm fronds. I went to sit at one of the children's fires, where attention was more firmly on matters of an immediate nature, the tending of the fire and preparation of long and slender twigs to roast sizzling bits of fish. At the fire, there was a young Mayan girl, not more than 8 years old, her hair braided with strands of bright fabric in the manner of her people. I marveled when I heard her speak with clear enunciation all the languages of New Madagascar, her tongue flipping easily from the chirps of Itza to the nasal tones of Kru. She spoke English with a northern brogue, learned from a man from Liverpool, she said, with the same turn on the third vowel. Dazzled, I lay myself down by the fire to watch the pop and jump of the sparks. All around me, the black of night was filled with people, many of them craning to follow the discussion. I lay listening as the girl wove a series of small tales in her small voice, half talking to herself, slipping back and forth among the many tongues at her command. Looking up at the starry sky, she made a story for each twinkling point of light, bestowing on each of them a name. She proceeded to conjure names for the phantom peoples who surrounded the flicker of that far-off fire, around which there was composed a council where her people gathered to share their pan bread and capybara stew and to plot the course of their destiny. I watched the sparks of the cooking fire leap and disappear into the black swamp, which echoed with the throaty song of bullfrogs and the chatter and scrape of insects. The child went on with her storytelling throughout the night. Each character in the narrative was granted a history, had words put into her mouth, was ascribed an interest and connecting relationships. I was lulled into dreams at the telling, and as I drifted between sleep and wakefulness, I thought I saw shadows flit across the spaces between the stars. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. It's so much fun to read. I really enjoy it.
That was such a beautiful reading. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. It's such a gorgeous book. I mean, all the rich details throughout and the history, it really is just impeccable the way it's written.
Thanks, Kris. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
So what do you think, guys? You got some questions?
Yeah, we do have some questions. I'm sort of thinking you should go first.
Excited.
Well, I have a question about character, but I think, Anca, you have a broader question. Maybe we should start with you.
I do have a broader question, and Tauno, that was a beautiful excerpt that you read. I'm glad you shared that with us all. I was hoping you could talk about, there's a fascinating kind of unexpected intersection of two pieces of history in your book, the intersection of piracy and slavery. And I was hoping you could talk about that intersection in history and also, but in relation to your story as well.
So thanks so much for asking that question. So the early 18th century, so I was drawn to I actually started out being kind of interested in pirates, and there's certain parts in my sort of own life, my own biography, where I've had a lot of curiosity about spaces where people kind of step outside of society or step outside of social constraints and try to do things themselves. And, also was really curious about the roles that sort of bandits and outlaws had, played in social movements throughout time. So sort of coming together around these interests, and then also thinking about the development of the modern world. And I kind of see this period of time where the book takes place, which is like the early 18th century, as being a period where there was a lot of the structures that we experience today as being really natural or in formation. And how that relates to, so a lot of structures around labor, and our relationship with money and wage work and stuff like that, but also a lot of ideas about race were sort of in formation, were definitely in formation, but the overlay between sort of slavery and the sort of racist system was not completely, it wasn't completely founded yet. There were still things that were happening. And so, yeah, I was interested in exploring any sort of research or looking into the Atlantic world at this time shows that there was this like motley crew of sailors, and any kind of, and sort of what that means is sailors were this sort of multiracial crew of men, for the most part, who were on these boats, and pirates would have to sort of make the decisions around incorporating, like sort of how do they interpret the sort of racial order that was developing at that time. And most sailing crews were up to a third people of African descent, or people from other kind of cultures that were like non-European cultures, and sort of how sort of pirates responded to that. A lot of the pirate crews actually included a lot of former slaves, or people that had been seized. Apparently slave ships were actually really popular sort of booty for pirates, not less in the sense of there being a lot of value in them, but that they functioned really well. So there was this kind of tension between sort of piracy and slavery, and this shared interest between sailors and then also people of African descent who were in bonded labor, in sort of seeking freedom and thinking about kind of places outside of these social structures where they could create their own lives. And I wanted to tell that story, and I think a little bit that's what I played with or explored in the book.
Yeah, that's sort of a natural segue into my question, which is about the character. Well, in particular, one character, but I should back up and say that one of the things I found so fascinating in your book was the way that the members of, well, eventually the ship becomes known as the Revenge, if I remember correctly, which I loved. They all kind of fall into piracy. It's not like they're like thinking like, I want to be a pirate. It just kind of happens very organically in order for them to survive in this very unexpected way. And one of the pirates who interested me the most was Jamil, who was a teenager, and the manner in which his character evolves after the pirates are marooned on New Madagascar. There's a great reveal about him that I don't want to give away because I want the readers to have that pleasure, but I was totally delighted and surprised. But without tipping your hand too much, can you talk a little bit about the historical inspirations for him and how you developed his character? Because I just loved how the role that he ended up playing on the island.
Thank you so much for asking that question. I really love Jaleel, and Jaleel is one of my sort of favorite characters in the book. And I have a few, actually. I have a few that I really like. And Jaleel, I mean, I think it's fair to say that Jaleel is a gender non-conforming character. And, we kind of, for those who read it, you'll sort of understand a little bit more about that. But in my understanding of like kind of history and the ways that gender, has shown up in history. That was also like, what I was saying, to the other question about sort of pirates and slavery, like I see this as a period when a lot of things were in formation. And there was a lot of things like the way that we experience gender today, has been experienced differently or lived or embodied differently throughout time. And in fact, like any kind of poking around or looking at the historical record shows us that people lived in all kinds of ways and had all kinds of expressions of gender throughout time. It's not something that's contemporary. It's like so much part of our discussions today, but it's not something that maybe people didn't talk about it, but it certainly happened. There was all kinds of different experiences. And I was just curious, like what, in a way, like the pirate space is a very male space, and so was sailing in some kind of way. And I was just curious in exploring that a little bit and thinking about, what that character, might have done and how they might have responded to the, pressures that were on them and around them, related to their life experience. But they're an interesting character, that Jaleel, right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I loved him. And I loved how respectfully everybody treated him. And matter of fact, it was really quite delightful.
Nice.
Okay. So I guess it's my turn to read next.
Yes,
exciting. Yay. So I'm going to be reading from, this is my debut novel, The Lost History of Dreams. It's a gothic or a gothic mystery, either way is fine. It's a Victorian set reworking of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. It's a myth that I've long loved, any kind of underworld myth, I am so there. It's about a post-mortem photographer who he's sent to photograph the corpse of his poet cousin, and in the process he uncovers the lost history, if you will, of his cousin's marriage. And it becomes a story within a story. The Lost History of Dreams is very much inspired by Gothic novels such as Wuthering Heights and The 13th Tale, the early novels of Sarah Waters. So basically, if you like those books, you will enjoy my book. The excerpt I'm going to read involves the first meeting of Robert, my postmortem photographer, or daguerreotypist, because this is 1850. It's about a year or two before what we would know photography or glass plate photography was even invented. So this is his first meeting with his poet cousin, Hugh, and he's a corpse. So without further ado. Robert bent his head inside. The study looked considerably different than the last time he'd been there 3 years earlier. Though the study had then held a coffin too, the room had been adorned with the trappings of authority and exoticism. A long mahogany desk scented with sandalwood, marble busts copied from ancient ones, silk tapestries from faraway lands. Now the only items of furniture inhabiting the study were the desk and a chaise draped in purple moire. The chaise had been in his mother's bedroom. Robert had a distant memory of lying on it when his head ached, her French perfume enveloping life like a song. It was before the chaise that his cousin's open coffin rested across a pair of sawhorses. This was his cousin who was dead. Though it made little sense, Robert stepped toward the coffin as though not to disturb. Robert wiped his brow and set down his tripod and the heavy wood case containing his daguerreotype outfit. He unbolted the leather straps. The buckles and slides reminded him of the livery on a horse's head. He lifted the boxes containing the silver copper plates, the bottles of chemicals and pigments. Finally, he removed the camera itself. It was a large box bound in honey-colored wood and glass. Boxes within boxes, locked and contained, just as he felt. However, once he set his camera on the tripod, he forgot where he was, the task he was to do, shifting from family member to daguerreotypist. It was easier than he expected, like putting on a hat before going outside. Robert examined the corpse. Hugh looked as he expected, like the corpse of a man well past the middle of his life. He was tall and thin, his auburn hair dulled by white, his hands ropey with veins and bone. No one could argue he wasn't dressed elegantly, his ensemble like anything Robert had ever seen. Hugh wore a well-tailored, dark-hued frock coat. Beneath it, a black velvet collar was attached to his linen, which was fastened by an elaborately bowed necktie. His trousers were cut of the same fine wool of the coat as though to match. Hugh reclined in the coffin, one long arm curved across his chest, as though overcome by surprise when his heart stilled. "What did you die of?" Robert whispered. "Where did you die?" Hugh revealed no sign of disease beyond approaching 80 years, nor did he bear the stench of decomposition. The subtle scent of almond indicated he'd been embalmed in arsenic mixed with spirits of wine. The high collar on his cheeks suggested carmine had been added to the mixture. Embalmed or no, Hugh's closed eyes had already sunken into his face. He must have passed about 2 weeks earlier in another land. A small brass plaque set inside the coffin was engraved with a Geneva address. Hugh had traveled far to come home. Inspired by the grandeur of Hugh's coffin and clothes, Robert would use his finest supplies, a gilding of gold chloride after fixing the plate with mercury. This would grant the daguerreotype the appearance of warmth, something his cousin's body now decidedly lacked in death. So we have to go Gothic there.
Awesome. That was great, Kris. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh, my pleasure.
The subtle scent of almond. There was something with the embalming. What was that? That was
Yeah.
such an interesting little detail. The subtle
Arsenic.
sense
Yeah,
of,
there's a really interesting factoid, if you will, that after the Civil War, a lot of corpses were embalmed in arsenic, and then they were buried, and the arsenic leached into the waterbeds of cemeteries, which obviously is not a great thing to have if you live by that waterbed.
no, but it sounds very gothic. I was curious, Anka, I'm gonna maybe go with a general question. I have like a big question. Maybe we'll do the same thing. I'll ask like a big question,
Yeah.
and then your question I think is a little bit more specific. I was thinking about, sort of after I read The Lost History and really enjoyed it, and kind of just the way that it sort of plays with this genre. It's not a genre I'm like super familiar with, but I really enjoyed the sort of ambiance and the space, and it was like fun, and then also sort of getting into some serious or kind of deeper sort of questions. But one of the things I did a little research around sort of where Gothic comes from, like what's this about, and like this form, this genre, and I was curious, what I found, just that somehow it was like the end of like secularization or whatever. And I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about sort of where this Gothic form sort of came from, and how it was responding to social events of the day or dynamics.
That's a great question. It's something that when you think about it, makes a lot of sense. It came into being. My take is that it was in the reaction to the scientific and industrial revolutions of the late 18th century and early 19th century. The thing about the Gothic, when you think about it, is that there's such an emphasis on subjective experience and interiority that is very much what I call the 2 Ds when it comes to Gothic, meaning dread and despair and desire and all that good stuff, as well as certain popular tropes that are definitely in response to the so-called March of Progress. There's haunted houses, there's a fascination with the medieval, like a time before everything changed with industrialization. Always star-crossed lovers, doomed lovers, even better, orphans, heiresses dealing with demonic suitors, and so on. There's something, it's like you're taking anything that's emotional and possibly supernatural and turning it up to 11, if you will. But yet there's, I think that it's something that is very feminist away, because so many of the protagonists of these Gothic novels are women who are seeking to free themselves in some way. Like if you think of one example, of course, is Jane Eyre, and she's dealing with a mad woman in the attic and finding her way in the world. But I notice that, I know the history of Gothics, and some people do and others don't, and they tend to think of Gothics as these 1970s novels, these paperbacks that you would buy and mass market, with these women dressed in nightgowns with long flowing hair running down a hill from the castle where there's like one light on in the tower. There's even a blog with that name. I think it's called something like Women Running from Castles, and it's hilarious. Like they have all of these book covers and the trope. But however, if we're going to go back even earlier, the first Gothic novel, believe it or not, was published in 1764. It was Horace Walpole, The Castle of Otranto. And it also had the Gothic castle, medieval times, and family curses, and so on and so forth. Then the next big Gothic novel I always think of, even though it was also started its own genre of science fiction, was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in 1818, with its nightmare vision of science run amok. But I always think that novel is so deeply grounded in Shelley's loss of her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, 10 days after her birth, because there's all these themes again about absent parents and orphans and abandonment. And of course, we have, Jane Eyre and the maid woman in the attic that I mentioned earlier, all the way up to the sensation stories and penny dreadfuls of the Victorian era. But also what's interesting to me is that the rise of Gothics also mirrored the rise of spiritualism in the mid-19th century, which offered women a chance to speak their truth without social censure through the mediumship. They could basically say whatever they wanted and say like, oh, well, this is what the spirits are telling me to say. And it was incredibly freeing. And there were usually these, young women who were very beautiful and got quite these followings. So again, it was about subjective experience versus the objective experience of the scientific. So in a sense, I see the Gothic as kind of a subversive literary form, especially if you consider, like I mentioned before, about their plots are women oriented. But, I've been thinking lately that we're living here in a pandemic, and we've been dealing for the past 4 years with all this unbelievable, talk about like demonic presences in the White House, if you will. So the world in a way couldn't be more unlike a Gothic. We're all kind of trapped within our own haunted houses. Sometimes we're getting cabin fever and living with those we love, and yet kind of getting to see another side of them that maybe we didn't know so much. And every time we leave our house, we feel like we're taking our lives in our hands, even though we're not running away from the castle and we're not wearing a nightgown, hopefully. So that's my take on the Gothic. I just love them. I just think that they're so much fun. You can play with so much. There's narrative, tropes, and I had a lot of fun writing lost history. I really did.
You did. It seemed like it would be a fun story to write.
Yeah, especially because playing with all these different narrative forms and stories within stories, and trying to decide, how to pull the wool over the reader's eye. There's a quote that Sarah Waters, whose books I adore, that says about that her job as a writer is that she's creating this kind of like funhouse ride, and her job is to lead the reader through the ride, the amusement park ride, knowing what's going to happen and what experiences they're going to have, but without tipping their hands. And when I was writing lost history, I thought very much about that quote quite a bit.
Well, Kris, I loved the intricate storytelling of your novel, and I enjoyed it very much, and I appreciated that there was a story within a story. And I wanted to ask us a kind of a specific question about, in the story about Hugh meeting Ada for the first time. He's said to be trespassing on her land. And when she protests, when she tells him you're trespassing, he shushes her, which is a really great way to start a relationship. And I was wondering if you could talk about the gender politics of that moment, and that, what you were doing in the story there.
Yeah, he's kind of a mansplainer, isn't he? Or, well, at least in that scene. Well, yeah, I mean, don't we all want to be shushed when we meet our future husband and when they're trespassing on our land, when we're heiresses and all that? I should place this moment into context for the book, that Ada is an orphaned heiress who winds up marrying Hugh, obviously, who is my famed Byron-esque poet, who was very loosely based on Byron, except that he leads a longer and more over-the-top life in some ways. Early in their marriage, Ada dies in childbirth, which inspires Hugh to write what many consider to be his greatest work of art, a book called The Lost History of Dreams, which is a poem cycle inspired by the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. And for whatever reason, this creates this almost like this rock star reputation for Hugh, that he has these fans following me everywhere, that they're called Seekers of the Lost Dream, and they wear, like black and red roses and all these other things that are inspired by his poems. So in a way, Ada's identity becomes lost in Hugh's, even though she's inspired these poems. At least that's what they want to believe. So Ada basically devolves in a way, so nothing more than being known as Hugh's wife and Hugh's muse, which is definitely foreshadowed when he shushes her when they first meet, that she's silenced. But what I love, though, is that the main plot of the book is basically about how Ada's story is reclaimed through Robert being able to write it down for Ada's niece, Isabel. But what's really sad is that the only way that Ada is able to get her voice known is through another man being willing to write her story. And there's a part in the book where Isabel, Ada's niece, explains to Robert that you have to write my story for me, because since I'm a woman, nobody will listen to me. You can publish it, you can get it out there, you can give it legitimacy. Otherwise, Ada's story is going to be lost. So there's definitely that that gender inequality and politics being explored there. But then at the same time, Robert becomes a little bit too invested in the story and starts adding his own contributions, which doesn't go exactly as one would think. But that's a great question about the shushing. Is I did that and I didn't even think that consciously about it. But yeah. I mean, I knew he was a mansplainer, but yeah, he does silence her. But thank you. Those are both really great questions. They were fun.
Anca, do we get to hear a little bit from you now?
Yes. So I will read from Daughters of the Air, which is about a family torn apart by Argentina's dirty war. So Daniel, the father in the story, is a Jewish sociologist at a public university, and he's disappeared. And in the section that I'll read, so the story is set in Buenos Aires, Brooklyn, and a few other places in 1978 and 1980. And the section I will read is in Buenos Aires in 1978. And Daniel has been missing for some time. His wife, Isabel, got one phone call from him and he said he would be home soon, but he didn't know when, and he couldn't say where he was. And she doesn't hear anything else from him about it. And she really struggles to tell her daughter what has happened because she's only 12. And it's a very difficult moment, of course. And she's also struggled to tell her friends what has happened. There's a refrain. There was a common refrain at the time. It must be for something. So if someone was arrested by the secret police of the military dictatorship, the assumption was, well, they must have done something wrong. And this is a refrain that Isabel had said herself early on in the dictatorship. So in this scene, Daniel has been missing for some time, and then this happens. One night, in the middle of the week, as Isabel lay in bed, a loud thumping beat the air above the house. It seeped into a dream. She was making a milkshake and dropped gleaming, slippery red fruit into the blender. She could barely grasp the fruits or make out what they were, neither raspberries nor strawberries nor plums, before they fell into the whirring milk. Instead of turning pink, the milk swirled into a deep crimson. The blender became so loud in its chopping and so terrifying that its noise roused her from the dream. A helicopter throbbed over Belgrano. A flash of light glanced into the bedroom. The windows shuddered in their frames. Isabel slid out of bed, knelt, and clutched the curtains. With one eye, she watched through the slit between them. As the helicopter hovered and then floated away, 2 green Ford Falcons screeched to the curb, from which several men in plain clothes emerged and marched up to a house across the street. The men banged on the front door. When no one answered, they kicked it in. A gust of wind swayed young tree branches, rustled leaves. Soon, the men dragged from the house 1 woman and 1 man. Isabel did not know them by name and had only rarely seen them slink in and out of the house. Through the closed window, she heard faint shouts and crouched lower. A scream that seemed to say a name, one she couldn't make out. She peeked out again. The man was gone, presumably inside one of the Falcons, which was pulling away from the curb. Wind blew hair in the woman's face, obscuring it. They shoved her into the other Falcon and drove off. Isabel released the curtains, which had become damp in her grasp. She rose, light-headed and unsure of what to make of what she'd seen. Proof of the country's far-reaching infection? She nudged the curtain open. The dark, wet street appeared as it always had. A rustle inside the house hardened her flesh. Jerking the curtain closed, she spun around. Pluta stood in the doorway. It was nothing, Isabel said. A bad dream of bad people, she thought. Go back to bed. The wood creaked beneath her daughter's hesitant, shifting weight. With the curtains drawn, Isabel could only make out the silhouette of Pluta's white nightgown and the faint gleam of her eyes. The small feet shifted and padded down the hall. The silence resurged. Isabel could even focus, it seemed, on the sound of her daughter's sheets being pulled safely around her. Pluta would fall quickly back to sleep. Isabel cracked open the curtain again and watched the empty street. What else would she see? Nothing, she assured herself. And yet she continued watching, her stomach trembling. At some point, two men emerged from that house with some bags. So they hadn't all left together. What did they carry in them? Evidence, she supposed. One seemed to make a joke, and they both laughed as they swaggered away up the road. Isabel backed away from the window and slowly sank into bed. But she stayed awake the rest of the night in a cold sweat, wondering.
Thank you, Anca.
That was so intense. So I think, Tauno, you have a more general question for Anca than I have a more specific question.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do it that way. I
Okay.
kind of like, it's like we have the funnel.
Yeah, exactly. Let's funnel together. It's interesting that you read that sort of piece, because in a way I was thinking as you were reading, Anca, that selection, the way that you're describing this event where there was all this stuff that was almost seen or not quite seen, or sort of hidden in some kind of way, but there's a lot of activity and motion in the other room. There's stuff going on, but people can't know what it is. So the book starts out with this inciting incident, which is the disappearance of this sociology professor who's Jewish in Buenos Aires, and the way that it affects his family. I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about the impact of that act of political disappearance, maybe the context of the briefly the context of the Argentine sort of dirty war, and kind of like what you're exploring and what your characters are experiencing related to kind of what happened to them.
Sure. Yeah. So the so-called dirty war occurred between 1976 and 1983. And up to 30,000 people were disappeared by the military dictatorship for, being suspected of having beliefs different from the dictatorship, for writers, journalists, students, activists, professors, and then people who were in the wrong address book, the wrong place at the wrong time. And so when I had first heard about this period of history, it was 2003. I was in college, and I was really, and it wasn't in a history class that I read about it. It was a book of poetry, Anne Carson's autobiography of Red. I was disturbed that at that point in my life, I hadn't already heard about this horrific moment in history that, to me, had parallels to the Holocaust, and also some of the rhetoric that the dictatorship used resembled some of the rhetoric to the War on Terror. So I really wanted to understand the notion of history repeating itself. That was, as a someone who at the time then discovered, well, I'm going to have to write a novel to figure this out, because that's what I do. I write fiction, is what compelled me to explore this moment of history. And so I did, I found memoirs and accounts by people who had been political prisoners, and I read many of those things. But as I was exploring this, this family, I really wanted to explore the effect on people who are maybe not as politically engaged, who are still nevertheless affected by what was happening. And so this notion that it must be for something, that the people who were arrested deserved it, was very disturbing to me. And so I needed to see what would happen if someone who held that belief, and who also just in a natural human tendency to look away from something very difficult, had to face that by a very, by having, someone as close as their husband, the father of her daughter, disappeared. So that was what I was doing with this particular family this time.
I think also, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just thinking about what you had said about like, well, there must be a reason for it. Like the way that we try to place horrific events into context in order to feel like we have some control when we really don't. They're just horrific.
Yeah.
So yeah. My question for you is more about your writing style, which I find just so beautiful and so enchanting. Your style, even though you're writing about these really gritty events, both in Buenos Aires and in Brooklyn, your writing at time reminds me of Angela Carter, who also wrote about a winged character, though a very different winged character. I'm thinking of Nights at the Circus. As an author, how do you manage to strike that balance between history and magical realism, especially about writing about something as dark as the Dirty War? Was that a struggle for you? And did you go into this book with a very conscious thought about how you were going to shape it?
I mean, my natural tendency as a writer, I have kind of an elastic sense of realism. And so I think, I mean, I would say that there was never a tendency to say, like, when I think about the whimsy, say, of, Angela Carter has her moments when she's very whimsical, which wouldn't fit this story, of course. But it makes me think about the magical realism bot on Twitter. I don't know if there's a magical realism bot on Twitter that has like ridiculous things that this was like what not to do. The bot will say things like, here's a premise, university professor, no, that's not a good one. I'm not gonna read that out loud. A 12-year-old baroness discovers a pair of spectacles which let her see every eyeball in India. So like there's that idea of magical realism where there's like this sort of whimsy to it, but that's not really what I was trying to do here, in terms of, using sort of somewhat fantastical moments to explore very difficult emotional material. And it allows you to explore the emotional material in a way that maybe realism, like psychological realism, would dissect the emotions in a way that just isn't, I guess, natural to me. But like I think of, like metamorphosis, and myth and fairy tale, moments of metamorphosis in myth and fairy tale as ways of sort of manifesting difficult moments in the human experience. So, I mean, I guess that's, what I'm attempting to do, but it's also that in the writing, I don't have this like intentional, it's going to be this level of the supernatural or this level of the fantastical. But, I want to be conscious of it, of course. And I also just wanted, there was a piece of writing advice that came from Ricky Ducournay several years ago. There was a discussion called Magic and the Intellect, and I just wanted to share it because I thought it was very helpful, which is that when you're writing about very difficult material, it's really important for to try to make the writing as beautiful as possible so that it's bearable for the reader. And so I took that advice to heart. I tried to consider that experience. Yeah. So,
Anka, you said the essay was Magic and the Intellect. Who is the author of that?
So there was a panel discussion at a writing conference, the AWP writing conference, but there's a blog post about it. So you can find the discussion, you know, a summary of the discussion, but it's called Magic and the Intellect.
Cool.
Yeah, and Ricky Ducournay was one of the panelists. She was the one that said that. So if you Google Magic and the Intellect, Ricky Ducournay, you'll find some accounts of it. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's
I liked
great.
your description of
do you all
I was going to just say that I really liked your description of experience reality as elastic. Yeah.
Should we remind if anybody's here in this discussion and they have any questions or anything, to drop them in the chat or the Q&A. I think actually we do have one question for the group. Chelsea, welcome back, Chelsea.
Hey, yeah,
From
we can go ahead and.
I think should I? Do you want to go ahead and read that question,
yeah,
Chelsea?
We can go into audience Q&A now. We have a question from Sean Smith, who asks everyone, what inspired you to ground your narrative in each of the time periods you decided to write in?
Oh, that's a great question. I can answer for myself. A lot of it was for technical reasons, because I knew that I had a photographer who needed to be able to travel with his camera kit. And so it ended up, after doing much research, I realized that he had to be a daguerreotypist, because they had they were called like outfits, and they were about like this big. I went to the George Eastman Museum to actually see them and to imagine how he would wear them, and you would put them on your back, you could walk around with them. Whereas if he was a photographer, he would have had to have like this whole cart with a dark room and everything else you could imagine. So in that way, it was very much kind of limited the years I could do it. And I knew that since I had this nested story, which I wanted to happen in early Victorian times of 1837, I kind of narrowed it down to, okay, my story is going to take place in 1850.
I would say for me, it was kind of like a little bit what I was saying before. I saw the early, I had a previous sort of interest in this period of time around the early 18th century as being this kind of liminal time, a time period when we were kind of transitioning, when there was a long transition, you know, as the Western world and the rise of the British Empire, you know, kind of became dominant and was moving away from feudalism and towards this modern system of capitalism, and you know, including the modern system of white supremacy and you know, different kinds of you know, social dynamics that we live today as if they are natural and you know, always you know, globally historical, when in fact it was like a system that was formed. And I was interested in looking at the time period during which that system was in formation through, you know, a story and in ways like a rousing, you know, like a story with elements of adventure and surprise and, you know, hopefully some like well-told scenes that sort of like rest lightly on the reader. So that was kind of my motivation.
And I was, you know, as I had mentioned, very concerned with the idea of history repeating itself. So in learning about Argentina's dirty war, and in, you know, in my personal connection, I'm a granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. So in thinking about how atrocities might recur, I had to explore that moment in history in that part of the world.
So we have another question here from Elizabeth Neal, who first says she's enjoying hearing you guys discuss amongst yourselves, but she would also love to hear from each of you how you approached your research and how far down the rabbit hole you went on tracking down historical details, environments, facts, etc. Maybe we can go in the same Kris, Tauno, Anca order.
I was going to say, I think Tauno should go first, because his research, I couldn't believe all the details and that you, between the everything from the way that somebody becomes a surgeon to the different flora and running a pirate ship. I was fascinated.
Awesome. I'm glad. I'm glad it came across okay. I think the challenge with sort of doing research is like how to like bring it in. I mean, at least, you know, in terms of like writing a story, like doing a bunch of research, gathering a bunch of like facts or sort of knowledge about a time, and then how to like incorporate it into the story. And that was something that took quite a bit of work, you know, like figuring out how to like bring it into the story that in a way that doesn't feel like didactic or you know, like a class or something like that. For me, I really love research, and there's something about, it's like when I know that I'm engaged with a writing project, when I'm just like, oh, I really need to know a lot around something. And, you know, the research process is really like a process of being curious, you know, and sort of like following leads and you know, looking at the bibliography of the amazing article, and then, you know, finding, you know, another book there, and sort of, you know, continuing with that. But then at a certain point, you know, turning towards the writing and trying to figure out how to bring, you know, all that material into the story in a way that makes sense. So in a way, it's kind of like it's a lot of cramming stuff in, and then sort of like expressing, sort of getting it out in some kind of way. But and not more scientific than that sounds. It's like a gluttonous, eating a lot of information and then just kind of staying in it a little bit. Mm-hmm. But Anca, how about you? Did you have any traveling, or was there any other kind of like in-person sort of research in your process?
I did, yeah. So I did research for years in libraries, and had written a first draft. And I knew I had to go to Argentina, but it was very expensive, so it just took a long time to get there. But when I finally went, there were two things that were very helpful to me. One was that in advance, I had set up a walking tour with this volunteer organization, Cicerones, and like you can tell them what you're interested in, and they matched me with a volunteer. So I told them I'm interested in seeing Jewish Buenos Aires, like I want to walk around the Jewish neighborhoods and learn everything that I can. And the volunteer, Eduardo, was amazing. Like he spent 3 or 4 hours with us, just walking around the city and giving us his take of Argentina's history and the Jewish history of, Jewish migration to Buenos Aires. And like the uncanny thing was he looked like a combination of my father-in-law and the father in the novel. So that was really amazing. And I had to rewrite the book after that, because, in the library, I had selected a Jewish neighborhood it's like the famous Jewish neighborhood. So, okay, the family lives there. I'm walking around, it's Once. We were walking around and I was thinking, Isabel, the mother and the family, would hate this neighborhood. There's no way they would live here. It's too crowded. She would not like it. And I asked Eduardo to tell me like what other neighborhoods should I look at. And one of them was Belgrano. And it's this more like bougie neighborhood. Went there, I picked out the house, and just like being able to see the house, or like that's where the family lives, gave me so much confidence to just like rewrite the book and feel like more authoritative about it. And then there's the second thing that was very helpful was going to the Museum of the City of Buenos Aires. They have a library. And I asked the librarians there if I could look at magazines from that era. And they just gave me piles and piles of like popular magazines. So I could see what people were wearing at the time, what were they writing about, what were they not writing about. And that allowed a lot of color into the book. Like I was just able to see things that like scholarly articles were not going to show me. So.
I have to piggyback upon Anca's comment about travel for research, because I find it to be so invaluable for my novels. And I did several research trips for The Lost History of Dreams. And also I had a similar experience, that I went to the local library just to look at, they had Victorian books of that era where they would list things like, where were the coaching inns? what were the different, like I remember being obsessed with train schedules, like how would my protagonist get there? Where would he stay? How would this work? And there's just no substitute for actually walking those places. So, and it was just also a wonderful moment that, you know, I had written the novel using, of course, like Google Earth and research or whatever to look at what the location looked like, because I was out in the countryside where I had set it. But then to actually walk those paths and to go inside the structures, and it was just mind-blowing, as the cliche goes. The interesting thing was that some of the things I described were pretty much there. It was almost like I had imagined it and into being, so that was quite thrilling.
We have time to squeeze in one more question here. Tauno Biltsted says, you all have brought such unique thoughts and perspective to this talk and your individual work, so thank you. In this world of fake news and convoluted facts, how have each of you sorted through balancing historical truths with imagined narratives?
Question. Balancing historical truths. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Like, where does this sort of fake news and, you know, how does it all fit in to, you know, like, you know, are we sort of, as in telling stories, are we trying to, you know, provide like a grand narrative? Like, I would say, like, in terms of my book, it's not so much an interest in providing a grand narrative as sort of looking at the experiences of kind of particular characters and trying to depict them in a way that is authentic. I was kind of in preparation of reading in preparation for this talk, I was like reading a little bit from the George Lukács book on historical fiction. And he's like a Marxist literary critic. And one of the ways that he, you know, distinguishes historical fiction from other fiction, and because there was writing set in historical times that was already happening in like the late 18th, early 19th centuries, but it wasn't, the writers weren't attempting to situate the characters within the historical space that was being told in the story. And so that's the way that he was sort of distinguishing historical fiction from just a book set at a certain time in history, you know, if you understand the distinction, or I imagine you do. So, you know, I you know, for my own part, like just trying to do my best as a writer and sort of researcher and somebody interested in the world, to, you know, place my imagination within the confines of the time, I suppose, is the way, just trying to be authentic. Maybe it's about intention. There you go. There's my convoluted answer. What do you think?
I think that a lot of it is trying to understand the mindset of that era and of the people who lived in that era. And so much of it is like, yes, you can, I love rereading books that are written in that era to try and get a sense of how people thought, even though of course it is fiction, as well as reading primary sources and such, just to kind of get that voice down. But ultimately it has to kind of come into, I think you use the word authenticity. It's like trying to find that emotional authenticity. Yeah, that's like the tricky part, and sometimes that takes a while to really locate, especially because I think that there's a tendency a lot of times when people think about writing historical fiction. I like what you said about Tauno, about like narratives being set in an era but that don't necessarily reflect that era. Is almost like they're window dressing, but you have to go deeper than that and to really understand the mindset. Like I always think about, you know, sometimes when I'm writing, because I am trying to use a sort of ersatz Victorian voice, like they're not going to be thinking about anxiety in the same way we would, because Freud hasn't even been born yet. That sort of detail you have to be aware of. What about you, Anka?
Yeah, I appreciated what you both said about the confines of the time and the mindset, because when that was, you know, thinking about like, well, what would a particular character know or perceive right, in the landscape, that if you don't know to look for something, what are you going to see? And one of the things that helped me with my book was thinking about the different ways different newspapers were covering things, both domestically and internationally. And that's a turning point for Isabel in the book, is seeing how, there was, the famous group, the Mothers of the Disappeared, who were protesting the disappearances, but in the moment, they were sometimes called by certain media outlets Las Locas, the crazy ladies. And so for Isabel, it's when she leaves Argentina and sees how they're, discussed, as like the Mothers of the Disappeared, that becomes a turning point for her. So thinking about different sources of information and how, the tensions between them can be very important to consider.
I
Thank
love
you
that.
all.
I
Go
love
ahead.
that detail.
Yeah.
I just love that detail about the shift and the shift in terms of the story for the character Isabel from when she's in Argentina and then sort of outside, and that sort of seeing, the way that people can see themselves differently depending on the stories that are being told around them.
And the shift in the name too.
Yeah.
Thank you all for those wonderful, thoughtful answers, and for tonight's fantastic discussion. We are unfortunately
so
out
much.
of time. But thank you so much, Tauno, Anca, and Kris, for joining us here tonight, taking this time to talk about your books with all of us. And thank you to everyone who showed up and made this space for conversation and connection. Reminder, in case you missed any part of it or would just like to indulge in a rewatch, that tonight's event has been recorded. It'll be up on our YouTube channel, Greenlight Bookstore, in a couple of days, so keep an eye out for that. And also a reminder that you can buy all 3 books, The Anatomist's Tale, Daughters of the Air, and The Lost History of Dreams, at Greenlight Bookstore. Either in store, we're open every day, noon to 7 p.m., or you can shop 24/7 at greenlightbookstore.com for local curbside pickup or shipping anywhere in the US. Thank you so much again, everyone, for spending your evening with us, and have a wonderful rest of your night. Bye.
Thank you.